You find an article in popular press, then summarize it, and then use economics to describe what's going on. So we'll do something similar for the extra credit assignment if you guys want to do it. You don't have to do it. So basically, you're doing the same sort of thing with like a news story, only instead of finding one out there, you're going to make one up yourself. Some kind of like 2020 news story, something that would fit this year. So it'll be 5 points on your final exam, 3 points based off how funny the story you make up is, 2 points off of like if you're explaining, I don't know, using supply and demand or something we talked about in class. So for example, you could say like, Joe Exotic breaks the record for the most like prison fan mail. That's a pretty 2020 story because how big Tiger King was. And then talk about how, I don't know, the market for stamps, seen an increase in demand for stamps. What, Joe Exotic and stamps?
Yeah.
Well, prison mail, like something like that, or like people like trying to flee, I don't know, the coronavirus, buying a ton of tickets on SpaceX to go to Mars, and you have obviously some leeway to like make shit up, and that fits with 2020.
There's certain dates due.
It's due before. We'll do this. You have to get it to me before the final exam starts. If you get it to me before the final exam starts, I post in a group with a bunch of my friends, and whoever has what they pick the funniest topic gets 1 bonus point on their final grade as well.
When exactly is the final exam?
I don't know.
Very much of them.
No, that's not it. So we're Monday, Wednesday, Friday. So we're Monday at 8 a.m. So you've got literally a week to get this done. So remember, 3 points of this are going to be how funny the scenario you create about 2020. 2 points is going to be if you do like supply and demand or something we talked about in class. So I'm going to be like putting in extra work. So like grade easy, if you guys are putting in extra work to actually do them, you might as well have a little bit of fun with it, right? All right, so today we're going to talk about European witch trials. We're going to keep going with this non-market decision-making stuff. Since I wasn't traveling or anything this semester for work, I had some extra days so we can talk about a lot of this weird stuff, a lot more than I normally get to. So normally when we think about witch trials, we think of the Salem witch trials, thanks to Arthur Miller's The Crucible. That's something like every high school student has to read. But we're going to be talking about European witch trials, and European witch trials from the Middle Ages. In European witch trials, despite what we commonly think of witch trials, it was both men and women who were accused of being witches, and it was people of all ages that were accused. In some places like France, they were primarily females that were accused. In some Scandinavian countries, it was actually primarily males that were accused of being witches. And I think it was Germany where it was like split fairly 50-50. So it was just people within the community being accused of being witches, using this evil magic at night, consorting with the devil, these sorts of things. Now, people in Europe had long believed in the existence of witches, not just like out there somewhere, but within their own communities. It was a very commonly held belief for a long time. And they had called upon church leaders for centuries to step in and vanquish the witches. And the church, for literally 1,000 years, had refused to accept the existence of witches. They said, no, this is superstition, these are made up. Excuse me. This isn't something that we're going to deal with. But then suddenly overnight, the church pulled a 180. They admitted that witches existed, and then did everything they could to hunt all the witches out of existence and to try these people publicly and execute them publicly for the crime of witchcraft and consorting with the devil. So as they reversed their opinion on the existence of witches, a literal witch hunt happened across Europe. So this is in about the mid-1500s. And suddenly the Great Hunt was on. And between 1560 and 1630, it was called the Great Hunt. So right around Strasbourg, France, about 300 miles around there in every direction, there were a ton of witch trials. And these included countries like Spain, Italy. This included France, Switzerland, Germany, where a lot of these witches were hunted. Countries like Spain, Italy, and Portugal largely avoided witch trials. So we had some places in Europe that were full of witches, some places in Europe that had no witches during this time. After the end of the age of European witch trials, so about 150 years, about 80,000 people at minimum had been tried for witchcraft, and about half of them were executed. So we went from ecclesiastical, the church authorities refusing to admit that witches existed for all this time, like constantly saying, no, they don't exist to the people. We had 1258, Pope Alexander issued a canon explicitly saying, do not persecute these witches, do not try people as witches, this doesn't exist. Suddenly, they switch in the 1500s. So we're going to talk about why that is and what's going on here. Now, there are some other theories of witch trials I want to talk about before we move in to what I think the real motive behind these witch trials are. The first is the scapegoat idea, that there are bad harvests or other negative income shocks that happen. So people who are frustrated, they don't know why they're suddenly poor, why their crops are suddenly failing when they weren't in the past. So they blame someone. They pick someone in the community that they don't like. They hold it against them, they accuse them of being witch. Now this happens today in Africa. There's a practice that it goes on in several different regions there. And typically the reason it's old women, that when there is a bad harvest, they accuse them of being a witch, and they're executed. Basically because they don't have enough food to go around, so they pick an old person who has nothing to provide to the community. So some people think this is what happened in Europe. And there was a little ice age in like the 1600s, where crop yields fell because temperatures dropped substantially. So there were bad harvests at this time. Agriculture was extremely important in the common people's lives in Europe. At this time, most of them still lived with like sustenance agriculture, which was like slightly above it. So they were growing crops to try to, keep themselves fed, them and their families fed through the year, and then sell a little bit extra that they had on the side. However, all of Europe suffered from the Little Ice Age. And all across Europe, we saw these negative income shocks during this time. But the witch trials were limited to specific areas within Europe. And again, mostly surrounding Strasbourg. So it doesn't give us a good explanation of why we see it in some places and not in other places. The next idea is legal centralization. These witch trials represented extra legal activity by citizens. So instead of going through the government to handle these crimes, they're taking care of it themselves. More like vigilante justice. And we see a decline of these witch trials once the state became powerful enough to actually suppress the witch trials. This does a really good job of explaining what happened in France. Doesn't do such a good job of explaining what happened in Switzerland or in Germany because they had strong enough governments during this time. And it also doesn't explain the emergence of witch trials. Why did we see no witch trials for so long, and then suddenly out of nowhere, we have the Great Hunt? The final is a legal torture hypothesis. So you can only have these witch trials where the inquisitorial methods are allowed to be used. Witchcraft was considered a special crime, like heresy, that you could not use normal interrogation to solve. So they could use a different type of interrogation, these inquisitorial methods, which included some sorts of torture and other harder methods, more painful methods, to get the truth out of the accused. But the problem is with this theory is that the inquisitorial methods were allowed 3 centuries before witch trials could be used. and they actually outlasted witch trials. So it doesn't explain either the emergence when it happened, or why we saw its decline. So what some economists believe, and what I don't know, I've been convinced the case, is this is an instance of religious competition in Europe. There's a competition between religions to try to get more people into the faith. So in the past, the Catholic Church had enjoyed basically a monopoly on the Christian religion in Europe for like 1,000 years. There were some heresies that popped up from time to time, but they're usually small and they were quickly dealt with. And they would use these inquisitorial methods. They would use coercion. They would use outright banning them and torturing the people that follow these heresies in order to defeat them. Basically, forcing people to convert to Catholicism or killing them. So, for instance, in the late 13th centuries, there were two different movements, two different heresies: the Catharian heresy and the Waldensian heresy. Basically, how the church responded is they declared all the people that followed those heretics. They could use inquisitorial methods against them. They launched the Albigensian Crusade. So they used violence to help, maintain their monopoly on religion. So that all the faithful that wanted, all the people that wanted, the protection of religion, the supernatural power that was associated with their religion, and the chance for eternal life, had to go through the Catholic Church. And obviously they're going to pay their tithes to the church, so the church is going to get money from it. I should note that the Spanish Inquisition wasn't actually as bad as is commonly held, as like it holds in our cultural, our idea of what happened. The accused had a lot of rights relative to most of the European continent at the time, and they set up a very strong system of how interrogations proceed, stepping from one level to the next, all the way up to torture at the end. Remember, we're talking about the Middle Ages, so torture was fairly common at this time. So these methods didn't really stand out compared to the rest of all the other European countries, what they were doing when someone was accused of a crime. The reason why we have such a negative view of the Inquisition, or one reason why we do in the United States, is after Henry VIII, left the Catholic Church, took England with him, the British exaggerated some of these issues. They had a very strong rivalry with the Spanish for a couple hundred years. Remember, the Spanish Armada actually attacked Britain at one point, trying to convert them to the Catholic faith and overthrow the British monarchs. So they didn't really like each other. So they were more than willing to play up how bad the Inquisition was. But the idea of the Inquisition, these methods were highly effective at the time and kept the church's monopoly for a long time. Now, in the early 1500s, there was work of a German priest that spread across Europe, criticizing the church for corruption and for religious abuses. It spread from Germany to all across Europe. You guys have an idea who this is? This was Martin Luther. This is the start of the Protestant Reformation. Initially, the church tried to use the typical methods they always had by just banning it, but it didn't work. So in 1520, the Diet of Worms, Pope Leo issued a papal bull that declared Luther a heretic and all his views heresy, and demanded he renounce them. Once he refused, the Holy Roman Empire, or Emperor himself, condemned him as a heretic, banned the publication of the 95 Theses and everything Luther wrote, banned the possession of his writings, and offered actually a bounty for Martin Luther himself. But something happened in the early 1500s. A German inventor named Hans Gutenberg invented the printing press, and this proved to be Pandora's box. It made it so much easier for writing to spread across Europe and spread across the world that the church was unable to suppress this new information. In the past, it was very difficult to spread information. Before this, if you wanted to print a page of a book, you had to carve out the entire template that the press used to make those words, by hand. What Gutenberg did was make individual letters that you could pull out, put back in so you could change what the page said. Made it so much easier to print these books. So knowledge is able to spread much quicker across Europe. This was like the invention of the internet, like 500 years earlier. That's how much it revolutionized the way people were able to spread information. Now there were some long-standing Catholic strongholds, Spain, Portugal, Italy, where Protestants did make inroads, where the church was able to just condemn Protestants as heretics. And it worked very well for the church here, just like it had for millennium prior. So you had these inquisitions, the Spanish, the Roman, the Venetian, the Portuguese inquisitions, that did an effective job at preventing these upstart Protestant faiths from coming in and taking the church's market share. But in other parts of Europe, the loyalty to the church was pretty weak. Large portions of the Holy Roman Empire actually converted over to Lutheranism or to other Protestant faiths. So obviously the church couldn't use their typical methods here. So a lot of territories in the Holy Roman Empire ignored the edict or failed to publish it at all. And it was 1555, the Peace of Augsburg decriminalized Lutheranism in the Holy Roman Empire. So not only was the church unable to use these typical methods, the civil authority actually said, no, we're letting this happen. So we're thinking of these religions as competing firms. They're competing over customers. In this case, the customers are the actual religious faithful, the people that are adhering to the faith, following the faith. So in order to keep their members and to actually grow the faith, the church, either the Catholic Church or these new Protestant faiths, had to prove to the citizens that they were better suited to their spiritual needs. Now the problem with this is that religion is what's called a credence good. By credence good, that there's no proof of quality. How can you tell if a religion is the right religion? How can you tell which one is going to best, make your soul as holy as possible? Right? Very difficult, impossible, really, to do. There's no real evidence of an afterlife. Again, this is one of the things that religious people have to take on faith. So it's very difficult for churches to compete on this. There's a scene from South Park where they all go to hell fairly early on. I don't know if you guys remember this one, but all these people go there, and there's the tour guide for hell welcoming them in. Some of the people are like, hey, what the hell's going on? I was a good Protestant, or I was a good Jehovah's Witness. And the guy's like, oh yeah, you picked the wrong religion, sorry. And they all start asking who was right. He says, it was the Mormons, actually. Because of course, guys from South Park love making fun of Mormons. This example just shows that we don't really know who's right. So it's very difficult for religions to compete on this. So they need to find some external, some physical way to actually show that they are protecting people and that they have this supernatural power. Remember, one way they showed this supernatural power to convince people to pay tithes was those vermin trials. And they tried to time the vermin trials to show that when the vermin naturally left, that it was actually the church and it was God ordering them. But there were other ways that they tried to compete. So there's a good quote that Europe's rival confessions, or rival religions, competed constantly with each other in demonstrating religious zeal. So one thing that Protestants tried to do to woo some more adherents was lower prices. They competed on price. They lowered and simplified the tithes that were required of people. They got rid of indulgences, of the actual indulgences where you pay money to get time in purgatory taken off. They made the tithe much lower. The 10% biblical tithe, you read about in the Bible, rather than the much more complex system of tithes the Catholic Church had at this point. They constantly preached and advertised about how their clergy was superior and how they were far less corrupt than the Catholic churches. And they started providing public services. So they established things like new schools to educate the youth. And again, education was pretty bad at this time for common people. So by offering this education, It was a way not only to instruct young people like in the faith and help, teach them about the religion, kind of make them like the religion so they'll keep following it through their adulthood. Also teaching them skills like reading and writing, and showing that this church is adding value to people's lives. The Catholic Church at this point had what's called a counter-reformation. They reformed the church somewhat to try to compete against these new Protestant religions, called it a new and improved church. One thing they did is increase canonizations and beatifications of religious, so we have now more saints, because saints are really popular for people. They were, the sports stars of the day, because there wasn't much going on in society at the time. People love saints, they love celebrating their feast days. Catholics established their own schools, spearheaded by different religious orders that focused on education, like the Jesuits. And one Jesuit even noted that the more that Catholic schools flourish, the more that you see increases in the Catholic faithful in those areas where they have the schools, the more difficulty Protestants have in attracting people of their religion. So they even noted this idea of competition at the time. And of course, the church cleaned up a lot of the corruption and the problems that Luther had noted in his 95 Theses. But there was another way that both Protestant and Catholic churches began competing in something to show their supernatural power, show their ability to protect people. And that was leveraging an old superstition, the belief in witches. They didn't have to create this kind of belief. This belief was widespread across Europe. All they had to do was take advantage of it. So these churches could evidence their commitment and their power to protect the local people from the manifestations of Satan's evil, which is what they really thought witches were, through their commitment to prosecuting witches, to finding them and removing them from the community. There's a bunch of examples of where this competition took place. So in Cologne, there was a big struggle to maintain Catholicism in an area that was completely surrounded by Protestants. So Friedrich von Wittelsbach in the late 1620s enacted what he called a final solution to take care of the witchcraft in the area once and for all. Again, he's got a lot of competition around him from all these different Protestant regions, so he's got to work extra hard to make sure he shows that Catholicism in his area works. Keep the people within the Catholic faith, rather than going to this new upstart firm founded by an entrepreneur. In Lorraine and 3 areas in the Rhineland, there was a very combative religious attitudes between the Catholics and these new Protestant faiths in the area. You had new churches being founded right in the same area as these Catholic churches. So there was strong witch hunts by both the Catholics and the Protestants to show that, they were more attentive to the community's needs. So in Troppau and Jägersdorf, Karl von Liechtenstein and Karl Eusebius oversaw several series of witch hunts as part of their re-Catholicization efforts. Those places, became Protestant, but these two important political leaders were Catholic. So in an effort to reintroduce Catholicism, get more people back into the faith, they started a bunch of witch hunts to catch the witches in the area that these people wanted protection from. Switzerland was highly contested. There was quite a bit of Protestant activity in there. The Catholic Church lost, you can call it, market share in pretty much all of Switzerland. St. Carlo Borromeo, who was an archbishop at the time, later became a saint, was an energetic witch hunter, doing everything he could to suppress witches in order to draw people back into the Catholic faith. And as a note, when I was in Arlington, my parish was actually named after Borromeo, which I thought was kind of interesting. As I was, we were talking about this in class in grad school, I was like, cool, I'm going to the church named after one of these witch hunters. So far I've been talking about Catholics, but Protestants tried just as hard to prosecute witches, to signal how much they're able to protect their faithful from these supernatural, evil people. So in Sweden, the Lutheran superintendent inaugurated these witch campaigns to, quote, dissuade citizens from returning to Catholicism. He was very clear about the purpose of these witch trials. Martin Luther himself condemned several witches in Wittenberg, and John Calvin, another Protestant founder, was advertising to the Geneva authorities to do as much witch trial activity as you can, both within Geneva and in the surrounding countryside. Geneva was a Calvinist stronghold, pretty much all converted to Calvinism like right away, but the surrounding areas, the rural areas, were still pretty heavily Catholic. So he needed, some more competition to get in there and win more faithful for his religion. And now these executions and trials were public affairs. So the whole thing was announced to the public ahead of time that they're going to engage in these trials because there has been some witchcraft activity. They go in, then they find the witches. They talk to members of the community, try to gather evidence and things like that. The trial is public and spectators can come show up and watch. Then at the execution, these are done, of course, in public to large crowds. People from all around the area, not just like the city or the town itself, but all around the area are coming in to watch us. Thousands and thousands of people showing up for these public executions. So these are widely public events, incredible advertising if you're trying to convince people that you're going to solve their witch problem for them. Now, how inquisitions functioned is that they tried to convince people to come back to the faith through basically threatening them with physical punishment and eternal damnation. They're going after heretics, people that have left the faith. For the witch trials, they're actually going after witches, who they think are witches. Practitioners of what they call diabolical maleficium. So they're not going after, in this case, Catholics aren't going after Protestants, and Protestants aren't going after Catholics. They're going after people that are nominally within their own religion. So they're clearing out the witches, the evil people who are hiding amongst them, instead of like their opponents. So this is what we see all across Europe in these witch trials, is they aren't the other religion being accused, not a way to reduce members of the other faith, but of, wolf in sheep's clothing, someone hiding amongst your own faith who really isn't, Catholic or isn't Protestant, but who's just evil. So the economic theory of witch trials, what it's trying to explain is first why we saw witch trials expand so rapidly in the early 16th century. And this is, again, when Protestantism first penetrated Europe's religious market. For the first time, we have these actual faiths in competition against the Catholic Church. They're not going away. They're legally allowed to be practiced. And a lot of areas are going over to the Catholic Church, or going over to these Protestant faiths entirely. What we saw in Europe at this time, after the Peace of Augsburg, is that these small territories, if the archbishop or if the civil leader would switch from the Catholic faith to a Protestant religion, the whole area would go to that Protestant religion. So rather than having, like we do now, Protestant churches and Catholic churches mixed amongst each other, people all living together and not killing each other, we did see that at the time. It was completely segregated between Catholics and Protestants in these areas. Now, this theory will also explain why we saw these witch trials not just happen, but accelerate so rapidly. And why this happened in areas where there was confessional there's a competition between the two religions. It'll also explain why we see a decline in the mid-17th century. So after the Peace of Augsburg, that legalized the Protestant religions. Places could go Protestant, they could go Catholic. But while they were switching over, so after the archbishop, or after the civil authority decided, okay, we're going to be Protestant now, there was still some time for those regions, for them to all the common folk to switch. So while they were in the process of switching, you would see violence. And you would see the civil authority in one territory attack the neighboring one if they were different religions, trying to like take over their territory and also bring them back to the religion that they had. After the Peace of Westphalia, that permanently fixed Europe's geography and what religions were where. So we had this dramatic reduction suddenly in religious competition, because now you can't attack your neighbor and take over their land and make them your religion again. Or you don't have people within there, some Catholic, some Protestant, fighting each other, trying to get one to be the dominant faith. And finally, this will show why we saw more intense confessional battles in certain areas that also had very strong witch trial activity. In other areas where there weren't these very strong competition between religions, we didn't see large witch trial activity. So basically, they just focused where there were two religions side by side. So there are places like Spain, Portugal, Italy, where we saw very few witch trials. Again, they were still suffering from the Little Ice Age. They still had these negative income shocks. But they didn't have this religious competition. And that's why we didn't see witch trials in this area, according to this theory. So, where did witch trials occur? Primarily in Germany. Almost 40% of all witch trials took place in Germany. Obviously, this isn't a complete list of every single witch trial. Getting data from 1300 about these cases are very difficult. But this is the largest data set of all witch trials that took place in Europe in this time. Switzerland was the next most area of heavy witch trial activity. That was 22% of the total. And again, when you look back at Germany and Switzerland at the time, they were the two biggest Protestant strongholds. They were the first two areas that really left the Catholic Church. So we would expect these to be two of the areas with the most witch trial activity, because we have the strongest competition. And in France, the third highest percentage of total, 9.6%. Again, we saw a lot of Protestant activity, especially in eastern France. We look down towards the bottom, we have Ireland, the Catholic stronghold. Poland, the Catholic stronghold. Even Italy with 1.4%. All these Catholic strongholds. So you see very little witch trial activity where the Catholic Church doesn't have its competition. Ideally, we would use data of the population in each area, what percentage is Catholic versus these different Protestant religions. But obviously from 1500, you're not going to get this kind of population, very local level information. So the best way to look at this is look at confessional battles. So battles that took place of a baron in one district trying to overthrow the baron in another district because they happen to be different religions, they want to take over their territory, return that territory to the Catholic Church, or make that territory part of one of the Protestant churches. So here we have an overlay of the confessional battles, or these dark dots, and the witch trials are these circular ones. We can see around Strasbourg right here, most of the activities taking place, or most of the battles, and most of the witch trials. We get southern Germany, eastern France, Switzerland. We also see a lot of confessional battles up in Netherlands and Belgium. And we see quite a bit, it's kind of hard to tell, but quite a bit of witch trial activity there too. These map up incredibly well. So there are a handful of countries, 75% of witchcraft persecutions and 69% of confessional battles occurred in Germany, Switzerland, France, England, and the Netherlands. Germany and Switzerland were ground zero for the Reformation, so we would expect this to happen if this is religious competition. And again, on the periphery, Ireland, Portugal, Spain, Italy, Catholic strongholds. Protestants did get a foothold there. Very, very few witch trials taking place here. Here we have the number of witch trials on top and the confessional battles on the bottom. So we see as these confessional battles increase, as they peak, we see witch trials peaking. As these confessional battles become more and more prominent over time, as there's more competition between the Catholic faith, these Protestant religions, we see more witch trials. About 1650, the end of this shaded area, we see the Peace of Westphalia, ending this religious competition, locking down these borders, who's going to be Catholic, who's going to be Protestant. We see the confessional battles fall, and we see the witch trials taper off. They're going to continue for some time, but there's no reason for them to stay at their high level because there's no changing religions in these areas. They're locked in at this time. All right, so in conclusion, the sudden emergence of witch trials can be thought of religious competition. We've got these multiple firms. Previously, the Catholic Church had a monopoly. Now they've got several competitors. So they're going to do what they can to compete against these new competitors who are taking away their market share. In areas where we saw these competitors, Switzerland, Eastern France, Germany, the Netherlands, we see these witch trials, this method of competition. Where we don't see these competing religions legalized and becoming popular, we don't see witch trials. So they use this existing belief, this existing superstition in witches to show that their religion was actually quality, that they had the supernatural power, and they were going to protect people, and to protect the faithful from the devil and his earthly manifestation. So where, in these places where there was competition, each religion wanted to offer the best possible religion to their adherents. We saw the Protestants brag about how they weren't as corrupt as the Catholic clergy. We saw the Catholic clergy reduce their corruption. We saw the Catholics add a bunch of saints because people love saints. They would do all these different things. The Protestants lowered the cost of tithes, simplified the tithes. The church got rid of a lot of the indulgences that you actually had to pay for. So there was this intense competition between these religions. One of the methods was witch trials. So this idea explains the emergence of witch trials, why it happened when it did, why we saw this sudden flip by the church, the locations in which they took place, and then why we see the end of these witch trials. You guys have any questions about witch trials? This might be the one that fits in most neatly with this class because it's actually like competition between firms rather than just proving that people are rational with like the weird shit they're doing. All right, if not, we'll end class here.